The telegraph office in Redemption Creek smelled of machine oil and desperation on the night Sallie Mercer's fingers stopped moving across the key. She had been tapping for 6 straight hours, relaying messages up and down the Western Union line between Redemption Creek and the territorial capital at Santa Fe, when the message came through that made her blood run cold. Not because of its contents alone, but because she recognized the cipher. She had invented it herself 3 years ago for a man she had trusted completely. A man who had since sold that cipher to Harland Voss, the most powerful railroad baron west of the Mississippi River. And Harland Voss was using her own code to steal 40,000 acres of Apache land. Sallie pressed her palm flat against the telegraph table to steady herself. The brass receiver clicked and hummed in the amber lamplight, and outside the single grimy window of the station, the main street of Redemption Creek lay dark and silent beneath a sky crowded with stars. She read the message again, decoding it effortlessly in her head because she could decode it effortlessly, because every dot and dash of it belonged to her. The scheme was laid out in its entirety: false land surveys, bribed territorial officials, a forged treaty, a railway easement worth millions, and a deadline of 72 hours before the paperwork was filed in Santa Fe, making it all irreversible and legal. She had 72 hours to stop it, or 40,000 people, and the land their ancestors had walked for 10,000 years would be swallowed by Harland Voss's iron rails. Sallie's hand moved back to the key with a purpose that had nothing to do with Western Union business. She began to compose the most important message of her life. She did not know yet that the man she was about to contact, a cattle inspector and former Pinkerton man named Cornelius Thatcher, currently 4 towns east in a place called Dustfall, would become as essential to her as her own heartbeat. She did not know that he would be sitting in a saloon nursing a whiskey and a considerable grudge when her message arrived, or that he would read it and immediately throw coins on the bar, saddle his horse in the dark, and ride 40 miles through the night without stopping. She did not know any of that yet. She only knew that Harland Voss thought he had won, and she was about to prove him catastrophically wrong. But to understand how Sallie Mercer arrived at that telegraph table on the night of October 14, 1882, you have to go back 6 weeks earlier. To the afternoon, a stranger rode into Redemption Creek with a broken saddle strap and a reputation that had arrived 3 days before him. The town of Redemption Creek, New Mexico Territory, sat at the junction of 2 dried creek beds and a wagon road that the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway had not yet reached, which was both its salvation and its slow strangulation. Without the railroad, the town remained small and honest in its own. With it, the town would either boom into prosperity or be reorganized entirely by the interests of men who lived far away and cared nothing for its people. The residents of Redemption Creek understood this tension, the way frontier people always understood such things, in their bones, before it became politics. Sallie Mercer had operated the telegraph office for 2 years, having taken it over from the previous operator, old Gerald Fitch, when Gerald's eyesight failed him so badly he could no longer read the ticker tape. She was 26 years old, born in Ohio, educated at a women's seminary in Columbus, where she had studied mathematics and natural philosophy before coming west with her father, a surveyor who had died of fever in the summer of 1879. She had stayed in New Mexico because she had nowhere else to be, and because the territory needed telegraph operators badly enough to hire a woman, which no telegraph office in Ohio would have done. She was very good at her job. She was, in fact, extraordinary at it, though she had learned to perform competence modestly, the way a woman in the frontier West had to perform most things that might threaten a man's comfort. She could send and receive at speeds that would have impressed the most seasoned operators in New York. She had also, in her 2 years in Redemption Creek, developed a system of personal encryption that she used to flag suspicious messages, messages that passed through the Western Union line carrying content that seemed designed to deceive. There were plenty of those. The railroad era was also the golden age of the telegraph swindle. She had taught her cipher to exactly one person, a federal land inspector named Harris Cade, who had passed through Redemption Creek in the spring of 1881 and spent 3 weeks working alongside her to document a timber fraud case that had threatened several homesteaders north of town. Harris Cade was a careful, intelligent man, and she had trusted him because he seemed to share her outrage at the exploitation of ordinary people by the powerful interests that were reshaping the West. They had corresponded for several months after his departure. Then his letters stopped. She had heard, eventually, that he had left government service. She had not heard what came after that. What came after that, she would learn on the night of October 14, was that Harris Cade had gone to work for Harland Voss. Cornelius Thatcher rode into Redemption Creek on a Thursday afternoon in early September, the sun sitting low and angry over the western mesa, turning the dust in the street the color of old copper. He was a large man, 6 feet 2 inches, and built like someone had needed the dimensions for a specific structural purpose, with dark hair going silver at the temples and a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same rock that made up the canyon walls south of town. He wore a practical suit of clothes, working clothes rather than dress clothes, and a hat that had seen serious weather. The saddle strap on his horse had given out 3 miles east of town, and he had ridden the remainder with one hand steadying the saddle by sheer grip, which said something about his strength and his stubbornness in roughly equal measure. He tied his horse in front of the livery and went to find the saddler, and then he went to find a room, and then, having accomplished both of those things, he went to the telegraph office because he had a message to send to his supervisor at the Bureau of Livestock Inspection, which was the federal agency that employed him now, and because he had learned over the course of his career that the telegraph operator of a frontier town always knew more about what was happening than anyone else in it. The telegraph office was a small room attached to the train station, which existed in Redemption Creek only in the optimistic sense. It was a platform and a ticket window built in anticipation of the railroad's arrival, which had not yet occurred, and which the residents were beginning to doubt would ever occur at the pace things were moving. The door of the telegraph office was open to the afternoon breeze, and Cornelius stepped through it and stopped. The woman behind the counter had her back to him. She was writing rapidly in a ledger, one hand moving across the page, while the other held a length of ticker tape up to the window light, reading it the way a musician reads sheet music, not haltingly, symbol by symbol, but in flowing comprehension, as if the dots and dashes were simply another language in which she happened to be fluent. Her hair was dark and pinned up in a way that had begun the day neat, and was now in a productive sort of disarray, with several strands falling loose around her neck. She was wearing a white shirtwaist and a dark wool skirt, practical clothes with ink stains on the cuffs that suggested she had been working since early morning and had not given a thought to the stains. She did not look up when he entered. "One moment," she said, still writing. Cornelius waited. He was a patient man when patience was appropriate. He stood with his hat in his hands and watched her work, and he had the unusual experience, which he would not have been able to articulate clearly at the time, of watching someone do something better than he had ever seen it done. The speed at which she was reading the tape, the simultaneous translation happening in her head, the fluid notation in the ledger. It was a form of expertise so complete it looked effortless, which he knew from his own experience in various difficult things was the deepest form of mastery. She finished, set down her pen, and turned around. Her eyes were dark gray, he noted, which was unexpected. He had anticipated brown eyes for reasons he could not explain. The gray eyes were frank and direct in a way that was also unexpected, not challenging exactly, but not deferential either, simply present, simply measuring him as he had been measuring her. "What can I do for you?" she said. He gave her the message for his supervisor, which was routine and brief. She took it, read it, noted the address, named a price, and went to the key without commentary. He watched her send it. He had watched many telegraph operators work. He had never watched anyone send with quite that combination of speed and economy, no wasted motion, no hesitation, each depression of the key precise and certain. "You've been operating for some time," he said when she had finished. "2 years here," she said. 7 years total. You started young." 18, she said. "My father taught me. He used it for surveying work." She paused, and something shifted in her expression, not grief exactly, but the shadow of it, quickly managed. "Are you in town for long?" "Probably a week," he said. "I'm with the Bureau of Livestock Inspection. There's a suspected brand-altering operation north of here. I need to look at several ranches." "Hardesty's spread," she said without inflection. He looked at her more carefully. "Why do you say that?" "Because I relay his messages," she said. "And the volume of livestock he's reportedly selling to the eastern markets doesn't match the number of cattle he's reportedly running. The discrepancy is approximately 30%, depending on the month." She said it the way she said everything, flatly, factually, without drama. "I flagged it to the territorial office in March. They sent you." "They sent me," he confirmed, and he felt something he had not felt in a professional context in quite some time, which was the sensation of encountering someone who had already done the work he had come to do. "You should be in the inspector's office yourself." "They don't hire women for that," she said, and it came out neither bitter nor resigned, simply accurate, the way frontier women stated many true and unjust things. "But they do read the reports I send. Most of the time." He introduced himself. She told him her name was Sallie Mercer. He filed this information alongside the gray eyes and the extraordinary speed and the 30% discrepancy, in a mental category he did not yet have a label for. He came back to the telegraph office the following morning, and the morning after that. The first time he told himself it was because he had additional messages for Santa Fe. The second time he told himself it was because she was a useful source of information about the local territory. By the third visit he had stopped explaining himself to himself entirely, which was the most honest thing he had done in a while. Sallie noticed his return visits. She was a woman who noticed things. It was both professional habit and personal nature. And she noticed that Cornelius Thatcher returned each morning and stayed longer each time, initially pretending to have business, and then, as the week went on, simply sitting in the wooden chair beside the door and talking with her between messages. He told her about his career. A decade with the Pinkertons before the work began to feel more like corporate enforcement than actual law, and then a shift to federal livestock inspection, which suited him better because at least the fraud he was fighting belonged to people who were genuinely committing it rather than people who were simply inconvenient to a railroad or a mine. She told him about her father's death and her decision to stay in New Mexico, and about the nature of telegraph work in a frontier town, which was in its way a kind of intimacy she rarely described to anyone, the degree to which she was the connective tissue of the community, the keeper of its secrets and sorrows and small celebrations, everything that moved between Redemption Creek and the larger world passing through her hands and leaving some residue of itself with her. He listened in a way she was not accustomed to. Not the polite listening of a man waiting for his turn to speak, but the real kind, the kind where she could see him actually thinking about what she had said and adjusting his understanding of things accordingly. It was disarming. She had developed considerable defenses against charm over the years, but she had fewer defenses against genuine attentiveness, and Cornelius Thatcher was a genuinely attentive man. On Friday evening, which was 6 days after his arrival, he caught her at the end of her working day and asked if she would take supper with him at the hotel dining room. She studied him for a moment, the large, careful man with the silver temples and the patient eyes, and said yes. They ate for 2 hours and talked for 3. The hotel dining room cleared around them, and the owner began stacking chairs on tables at the edges of the room, and still they sat, working through a conversation that kept opening into new territory the way good conversations do, each answer producing 3 new questions, each story suggesting another story below it. He learned that she could read classical Greek, which she had taught herself from a textbook found in a dead man's saddlebag, and that she had opinions about territorial water rights that were more sophisticated than those of most lawyers he had met, and that she had a particular contempt for the way powerful interests used legal complexity to obscure straightforward theft, which was a contempt he shared so completely it startled him. She learned that he had grown up in Kentucky on a farm that failed, that he had come west at 17 and worked as a cowhand for 4 years before a federal marshal offered to take him on as a deputy, that he had been married briefly at 24 to a woman named Clara who died of a riding accident 18 months into their marriage, and that he had been essentially alone since then, not unhappily exactly, but quietly. In the way a man who has lost someone he loved moves through the world with extra care about where he puts his feet. He was 31 years old. She was 26. Neither of them was a child. Neither of them was unacquainted with difficulty. Sitting across a candle-lit table from each other in the emptying hotel dining room of Redemption Creek, New Mexico Territory, in September of 1882, they were simply 2 people made more real by proximity to each other than they had been made by anything else in some time. He walked her back to the small house she rented 2 blocks from the telegraph office. At the gate, he stopped and turned his hat in his hands, a gesture she had already learned to associate with him thinking carefully about something, and said, "I'm going to be here another week. The Hardesty investigation is more complicated than I expected." "It usually is," she said. "Would you take supper with me again tomorrow?" She considered this. She was not a woman who made decisions carelessly, and she was aware that a man like Cornelius Thatcher, solid and decent and attentive in the way that was genuinely dangerous to her equilibrium, was a more serious proposition than an evening of pleasant company suggested. But she was also 26 years old and tired. In the private way, she never showed anyone of the particular loneliness of being the most competent person in the room and having no one to tell about it. "Yes," she said. What neither of them knew on that Friday evening in early September, as Sallie went inside and Cornelius walked back to the hotel with something loosened in his chest, was that within 3 weeks the situation in Redemption Creek would become not a livestock investigation, but something enormously larger, and that the forces they were both individually, separately, already suspicious of, the forces of concentrated capital and legal corruption, and the casual destruction of communities by men in distant offices, were about to converge on their small town in the form of Harland Voss. Harland Voss arrived in Redemption Creek on the 3rd Monday of September, which was also the day Cornelius concluded the Hardesty investigation and filed his report, and the day Sallie began to notice a significant increase in encrypted telegraph traffic moving through her station. Voss was 60 years old, thick through the chest and shoulders, with white hair that he wore long and a manner that combined elaborate courtliness with the unmistakable implication that his courtesy was optional and his power was not. He had made his first fortune in Pennsylvania coal and his second in the railroads, and he was currently building what he described publicly as the Rio Grande and Northern Railway, a line that would, according to his statements to the territorial press, bring prosperity and connection to the remote communities of New Mexico Territory. He traveled with a secretary, 2 lawyers, and 4 men whose official function was unclear but whose physical presence communicated it adequately. He came to the telegraph office on his first morning in town, which was the morning Sallie noticed him, and he was charming and efficient and paid for his messages in crisp banknotes rather than coin, which in itself was a minor signal. Men who carried that kind of paper money in frontier towns were men who moved in a different economy than the one operating around them. He sent 5 messages that morning. Sallie transcribed and relayed them all. 3 were routine communications with his business offices in Denver. 1 was to a federal land office in Santa Fe. And 1 was in a cipher she almost didn't catch, because it was not an unusual cipher. It was not the kind of obvious scrambled alphabet that most people used when they wanted to obscure content. It was her cipher. The one she had invented. The one she had shared only with Harris Cade. She sat very still for a moment after she recognized it. Then she relayed the message, because her job was to relay the message, and because showing her hand immediately would have been tactically foolish. But she kept the ticker tape. She began, that evening after the office closed, to decode it. The message was to someone identified only by a numerical code. It referenced a survey document, a payment schedule, and a timeline. It mentioned, in the careful impersonal language of serious crime, something that could only be a land acquisition achieved through fraud. She could not decode the full content from a single message. She needed more. She said nothing to Cornelius that evening over supper. She was still turning it over, testing its implications, trying to understand the architecture of what she had glimpsed. She had learned, from years of managing dangerous information through a wire, that premature disclosure was as harmful as silence. She needed to know what she was dealing with before she could decide what to do about it. She did, however, ask him a question she framed as casual curiosity. "What do you know about the Rio Grande and Northern?" He looked at her over his coffee cup with the attention he always gave her questions. "Voss's line," he said. "There have been questions in Denver about the land survey practices. Nothing formally investigated yet." "What sort of questions?" "The sort," he said carefully, "that suggests the surveys may not reflect what they claim to reflect." He paused. "Why?" "He's been through the office today," she said, "sending considerable traffic. That's not unusual for a railroad man operating in the territory." "No," she agreed, "it isn't." And she changed the subject because she was not ready yet. But she watched, and she listened. And every day for the following 2 weeks, more encoded messages moved through her station, and she transcribed and decoded each one with a patience that was itself a form of extraordinary skill. The ability to hold a long accumulation of partial information and construct from it, piece by piece, a complete picture. Cornelius, meanwhile, had concluded his official business in Redemption Creek, but found reasons to remain. He told himself, and his supervisor in Santa Fe, that he was gathering additional evidence on a secondary fraud he had detected at the edge of the Hardesty operation. This was true but incomplete. The complete truth was that leaving Redemption Creek felt, when he considered it carefully, like an error he was not willing to make. He and Sallie had developed a rhythm by the 3rd week of September that had the naturalness of long familiarity despite its brevity. Evenings, they ate together. On her days off, which came once a week on Sundays, they walked or rode. She was a capable rider who had been trained by her father and who had a strong-gaited gray mare she kept at the livery. And they talked with the compulsive thoroughness of 2 people discovering that another person's mind is a territory they want to map completely. He told her things he had not told anyone in years. She told him things she had never told anyone because there had never been anyone capable of hearing them. He was aware, in a way that was new for him, that his admiration for her exceeded anything he had expected to feel in her direction. He had been drawn to her immediately, physically. He was a straightforward man about such things and did not deceive himself. But what had grown in the weeks since was something richer and more complex. The intelligence that operated in her, with the same ease and constancy as breathing. The principles that ran through her decisions like structural steel, not dramatic or announced but load-bearing in everything she did. The humor that surfaced unexpectedly, dry and precise and surprising. He was not accustomed to feeling that another person was simply better at things than he was. Not many people were, in his experience, better at much of anything, but in the specific domains of Sallie Mercer's expertise, he was aware of being comprehensively outclassed, and he found that he did not mind it. He found, in fact, that it delighted him. He told her this on a Sunday afternoon in late September, when they were sitting on a low rock shelf above the creek bed south of town, watching a hawk work the thermals over the canyon in the thin golden light of a cooling afternoon. He told her somewhat approximately that he had never met anyone who did what she did with the degree of facility with which she did it, and that he meant this about more than the telegraph work, and that he was aware this was an unusual thing to say to a woman on a rock shelf in New Mexico, but that he felt it would be dishonest not to say it. She looked at him for a long moment. The hawk turned above them. The light moved. "Cornelius," she said, "have been managing other people's astonishment at my competence for a long time. I'm not ungrateful for yours, but what I would rather you told me is what you actually feel." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said very directly, in the manner that was characteristic of him at his most honest, "I think I am falling in love with you. I think it has been happening since the first morning. I am telling you now because I believe you prefer directness to circumlocution." "I do," she said. "And?" He said. "And," she said, more slowly, working through it as she worked through everything carefully, rigorously, without hurry, "I believe something similar is happening to me. Which is both very welcome and somewhat inconvenient because I am in the middle of something serious." "What do you mean?" she told him. She told him all of it, the cipher, the accumulated messages, the partial picture she had been assembling for 3 weeks. She told him about Harris Cade. She told him what she believed Harland Voss was doing. She watched his face as she spoke, watched the careful attentiveness shift into something sharper, more focused, the expression of a man whose professional instincts are fully engaged. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "How complete is the picture?" he said. "Not complete enough," she said. "I need the land survey documents themselves or the messages that reference them specifically to make it irrefutable. I have enough to be certain what it is. I don't have enough to prove it to anyone who doesn't already know the cipher." "What do you need?" "Time," she said. "More messages, and whoever Voss is sending to in Santa Fe, I need to identify them." "The bribed official," he said. "Yes." He looked out at the canyon. The hawk had moved east, become a speck. "This is bigger than livestock fraud," he said. "Considerably," she said. "You've been sitting on this for 3 weeks," he said, and it was not an accusation, but she heard the undercurrent of it, the slight shade of "why didn't you tell me sooner," and she addressed it directly. "I have been assessing it," she said. "I needed to understand it fully before I brought anyone else in. Premature action would have given Voss time to cover his tracks and change the cipher." He absorbed this. She waited, and she noticed that she was waiting with something that was not quite anxiety, but was adjacent to it. The particular vulnerability of having told someone something important, and not yet knowing how they will receive it. He looked back at her, and his expression was something she would remember for a long time afterward, complete respect, without qualification or condition. "You're right," he said. "What do you need me to do?" What she needed him to do, initially, was nothing. She needed him to continue his presence in Redemption Creek, which he was doing anyway, and to make nothing about his behavior suggest that anything had changed. She needed him available but unobtrusive, because any change in pattern that reached Voss's observation might cause the man to alter his communications or move up his timeline. She needed to keep collecting messages. This was harder for Cornelius than she understood, and easier than she feared. It was harder because he was by nature and training a man who acted, who moved toward problems and engaged them physically and procedurally. And being asked to wait, while someone else managed the primary intelligence work, ran against every instinct he had. It was easier because the person asking him to wait was Sallie Mercer, and his trust in her judgment had by this point become as natural as his trust in his own, which was something he would not have predicted of himself. October came in cool and dry. The aspens in the higher country were turning gold. The encoded traffic through Redemption Creek's telegraph office increased sharply in the first week of the month, which Sallie took as a sign that Voss's timeline was accelerating. She decoded each message. The picture became clearer. The forged treaty was real. The bribed official was a man named Colton Marsh, deputy superintendent of the New Mexico Territorial Land Office, who had accepted a payment of $8,000 to certify false survey documents as genuine. The Apache land, 40,000 acres of the Mescalero homeland in the Guadalupe Mountains, land that was protected by an 1873 federal agreement, would be absorbed into the railroad easement on the strength of those documents. The deadline was 72 hours from October 14, when Voss would send the complete package of fraudulent paperwork to Santa Fe for filing. Once filed, reversing the action would require a federal lawsuit that would take years and would likely, given the state of territorial justice, fail. Sallie worked with the knowledge of all this for 6 days before the night of October 14. She was not afraid exactly. She had moved past fear into the calm urgency of a person who knows what needs to be done and is focused entirely on doing it. She prepared her response carefully. She wrote out in plain language the full account of Voss's scheme, the messages, the decoded content, the names, the payments, the timeline, in a document she copied 3 times. One copy she sealed and addressed to the United States Attorney for the Territory of New Mexico. One copy she addressed to the Denver office of the Bureau of Livestock Inspection, which was Cornelius's agency. One copy she kept. Then she identified the most important message she could send, and to whom, and she drafted it and sent it on the night of October 14, after the latest encoded message had come through and she had decoded it and understood with complete certainty the full extent of the crime. The message she sent was to the Bureau of Livestock Inspection, addressed to Cornelius Thatcher's supervisor, with a copy flagged to the U.S. Attorney's Office in Santa Fe, and it contained, in its entirety, the decoded scheme, the identities of the participants, and a demand for immediate federal intervention. She sent it in plain language because the time for discretion was over. Then she sent a second message, a short personal one, to Cornelius himself, who was 4 towns east in Dustfall, where he had gone 2 days earlier on what he thought was a routine follow-up to a related livestock case, but which Sallie now suspected Voss's people had engineered specifically to get him out of Redemption Creek at the critical moment. The message to Cornelius read, "Come back immediately. Voss' scheme is complete and documented. I have sent to your supervisor and the U.S. Attorney. There is a component you need to handle here that I cannot. 40 miles, night ride. Come now." She did not say please. She knew him well enough to know she did not need to. He saddled his horse in Dustfall at 11:15 at night, having read her message 3 times in the lamplight of the saloon where the Western Union office delivered it. He left a coin on the bar for the half-drunk whiskey. He told no one where he was going. He rode into the dark at a pace that was controlled but unrelenting, and he covered 40 miles of New Mexico territory in 4 hours and 20 minutes, arriving in Redemption Creek as the sky was beginning to lighten in the east. He went directly to the telegraph office. The light was still on. Sallie heard the horse and was at the door before he dismounted. She looked at him trail dust, 4-hour hard-ridden, still steady on his feet though she could see the fatigue in the set of his shoulders, and said, "I'm glad you're here." "Tell me everything," he said. She told him everything. It took 20 minutes, standing in the doorway of the telegraph office in the early blue light of October 15, and she was systematic and complete and moved through the account without dramatization or digression, which he found, despite the seriousness of it, deeply beautiful, the pure competence of her, the architecture of what she had built from fragments and patience and brilliant analytical work. When she finished, he was looking at her with the expression she had identified on the rock shelf above the canyon, complete respect without qualification. But there was something else in it now, something warmer and more urgent. "The component I need to handle," he said. "Voss has people here, physical people. 4 of them," she said, "the ones who came with him. And Voss himself. He's at the hotel. He leaves for Santa Fe at 8 o'clock this morning with the documents. He needs to be stopped before he boards the stage." Cornelius looked at the lightening sky, It was perhaps 5:30 in the morning, 2.5 hours. "My supervisor in Santa Fe will have received your message by now," he said. "If he acts immediately, and he will because the content is unambiguous, he can have federal marshals at the Territorial Land Office by mid-morning. Colton Marsh cannot file what isn't brought to him." "But Voss needs to be detained here," Sallie said. "If he reaches Santa Fe, he can claim the message is false, discredit it, use his lawyers. He needs to be detained on federal authority before he leaves this town." "I have federal authority," Cornelius said quietly. "Limited, but applicable. Bureau inspectors can detain individuals suspected of federal land fraud pending marshal arrival. Can you do it alone?" "He has 4 men. "I'm not alone," he said and looked at her, and she understood that this was not simply a statement about personnel. The sheriff of Redemption Creek was a man named Albert Prue who was adequate in ordinary circumstances and who had the important quality, for their present purposes, of being genuinely honest. Cornelius went to Albert Prue's house at 5:45 in the morning and woke him, and laid out the situation with the same brevity and precision that Sallie had used on him, and Albert Prue, to his considerable credit, said only, "What do you need from me?" and began getting dressed. At 7:15 in the morning, Harland Voss came down the stairs of the Redemption Creek Hotel to find Cornelius Thatcher, Sheriff Albert Prue, and 2 deputies waiting for him in the lobby. Voss was dressed for travel, a fine coat, a hat with a leather band, a briefcase that he was carrying himself rather than delegating to his secretary, which told Cornelius that the briefcase contained the documents. His 4 men were behind him on the stairs, and they stopped when they saw the welcoming party, and for a moment the whole scene held itself still, like a landscape before weather. "Mr. Voss," Cornelius said, "I'm Cornelius Thatcher, Bureau of Livestock Inspection. I'm detaining you on suspicion of federal land fraud pending the arrival of United States Marshals from Santa Fe. I'll need you to surrender that briefcase." Voss looked at him for a long moment. The courtesy had gone out of his face. What was beneath it was harder and older and considerably less pleasant. "On what basis?" he said. "On the basis of 18 days of decoded telegraph correspondence between yourself, your secretary, Harris Cade, and Colton Marsh at the Territorial Land Office," Cornelius said, "which has been fully documented and forwarded to the U.S. Attorney's Office in Santa Fe. The basis is thorough." Something moved in Voss's face then, the first real crack in the composure. He said very quietly, "No one can decode that correspondence. The cipher was private." "The cipher," Cornelius said, "was developed by the telegraph operator of this town, who was kind enough to share it with Harris Cade, who was unkind enough to sell it to you. She recognized it the first morning you used it. You've been decoded for 18 days, Mr. Voss." Voss looked past Cornelius, toward the door of the hotel, and Cornelius followed his gaze and saw what Voss saw. Sallie Mercer standing in the doorway of the hotel in the morning light, with the gray eyes and the ink-stained cuffs and the 3 sealed documents in her hand, and the expression on her face of someone who has done precisely what she set out to do. "The cipher was mine," she said simply. "I've known what you were doing since the first message." The silence that followed had the quality of something final. Harland Voss was a man who had won for a very long time, with money and legal complexity and the particular blindness of powerful men who believe that the people around them are simply instruments of their convenience. He had not anticipated this. He had not, specifically, anticipated her. He surrendered the briefcase. The 4 men on the stairs, with Sheriff Prue's deputies making their own silent argument, did not resist. The federal marshals arrived from Santa Fe at 2 o'clock that afternoon, which was fast enough to suggest that Cornelius's supervisor at the Bureau had acted within minutes of receiving Sallie's encoded transmission. Colton Marsh at the Territorial Land Office was taken into custody at 11 that morning, before Voss could reach Santa Fe or send any warning. The forged documents in the briefcase were examined by the marshal's legal specialist, who confirmed what Sallie's decoded messages had indicated. They were sophisticated forgeries, but forgeries nonetheless, and the fraud was complete and prosecutable. Harris Cade was arrested in Denver 6 weeks later, having been identified through the Telegraph correspondence. He cooperated with federal investigators in exchange for a reduced sentence, which was how it usually went with men who had sold their integrity rather than their freedom. He confirmed that he had given Sallie's cipher to Voss for a payment of $2,000, and that he had been aware of the general nature of Voss's scheme, and that he had understood what the use of that cipher would mean for the communities in New Mexico whose land was targeted. His cooperation did not make Sallie feel better about any of it, but it did complete the case. The 40,000 acres of Mescalero Apache land remained protected under the 1873 federal agreement. The Rio Grande and Northern Railway was restructured under new management following Voss's federal indictment, and the new survey for the line's route was conducted honestly, and it missed the protected lands entirely. None of this resolved itself in a day or even a week. The weeks following October 15 were full of federal paperwork and legal depositions, and the slow, unglamorous machinery of actual justice, which was considerably less dramatic than the morning in the hotel lobby, but considerably more important. Sallie gave testimony. Cornelius coordinated with the marshal's office. They were both busy in ways that kept them apart more than either of them wanted. But the evenings when they had them were theirs. On the evening of October 16, the day after the arrests, Cornelius came to the telegraph office at the end of Sallie's shift. He stood in the doorway, large and dusty from a day of writing and depositions and organized chaos, and he looked at her across the small room with the amber lamp and the brass receiver and the smell of machine oil, and he said without preamble, "I have been watching you work a case for 3 weeks without my knowledge, and you did it better than I would have done it, and the outcome was better for that. I need you to know that I understand that." "I know you understand it," she said. "I also need to tell you," he said, "that I am going to be asked to return to Santa Fe within the week for the formal deposition process, and that I do not intend to leave Redemption Creek without—" He stopped, started again. "I am not good at this part," he said. "You're doing fine," she said. "I want to know if you will consider if it's something you would—" He stopped again, pressed his lips together, tried once more. "I want to ask you to marry me. I'm asking it badly and I know it, and if you need time, I understand completely, but I wanted to ask it before I lost my nerve." Sallie looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the street of Redemption Creek was going about its evening business. The clatter of a wagon, someone's dog barking at something persistent, the distant sound of a piano from the direction of the saloon. The ordinary music of a small frontier town in the October of 1882. She thought about the conversation on the rock shelf, about directness and circumlocution, about the gray eyes he had not expected and the attentiveness she had not defended against. About 18 days of lonely, dangerous, necessary work, and the absolute certainty with which she had sent him that message in the night, "Come back, I need you," and the absolute certainty with which he had come. "Yes," she said. "Not badly at all." He crossed the room and she met him halfway, which was the only fair arrangement, and the first time he kissed her it was in the telegraph office of Redemption Creek, with the lamp throwing warm shadows and the key silent for once on its table, and it was complete and unhurried, the kind of kiss that settles a question permanently. They were married in Redemption Creek on the 3rd Saturday of November, 1882, which was a cool, bright day with the sky, the deep saturated blue that only the southwest sky achieves in autumn. The ceremony was performed by the circuit minister who came through every 6 weeks and was attended by practically everyone in town, because Sallie was the telegraph operator and therefore the center of the town's connective tissue, and because Cornelius had been around long enough that people had formed opinions about him, and the opinions were largely favorable. Albert Prue stood up for Cornelius. The woman who kept the millinery shop, A formidable widow named Eugenia Dalton, who had been Sally's closest friend in Redemption Creek, stood up for Sallie. The ceremony was brief, and the party afterward at the hotel was not brief at all. There was dancing. Cornelius was a better dancer than his dimensions suggested. Sallie was a completely unsurprising excellent dancer. They danced until 11 o'clock and went home to the house she rented, which was now theirs, and the night was cold and clear, and the stars over New Mexico were indiscriminate and astonishing. In the weeks following the wedding, Cornelius and Sallie began to build the kind of life that neither of them had permitted themselves to imagine too specifically before, because imagination without confidence of fulfillment was a form of grief they had each experienced enough of. They built it practically and specifically. He negotiated with the Bureau of Livestock Inspection for a permanent posting in the Redemption Creek region, rather than the roving assignment he had held, which his supervisor granted partly because the Voss case had established the region as a federal priority, and partly because Cornelius made a good argument and his supervisor was a fair man. She kept the Telegraph office, which suited her in every way and which she was not remotely prepared to relinquish, and the town and her supervisors at Western Union were not remotely inclined to ask her to. They were well matched in their daily life in ways that went beyond the obvious compatibility of their values and their conversation. He was a man who functioned well in practical circumstances and who did not require emotional management. She was a woman who had been managing her own emotional needs for long enough that having someone genuinely invested in her well-being was startling and wonderful rather than suffocating. They argued occasionally. She was precise and he was decisive, and these qualities sometimes pulled in different directions, but their arguments had a quality of mutual respect that made them productive rather than damaging. They listened to each other with the same real attention he had shown her from the first day. In the spring of 1883, Sallie told Cornelius she was expecting a child. He was in the kitchen when she told him, cleaning his boots at the table, and he went very still in the way he went still when he was processing something significant, and then he put the boots down and looked at her with an expression she did not have a name for but that she felt in her chest like something fundamental settling into its proper position. "Are you well?" he said. "How are you feeling?" "Good," she said. "I'm feeling very well. I wanted to tell you before I was certain, but I'm now certain." He came around the table and held her, carefully, in the manner of a very large and strong man who has suddenly become intensely aware of the fragility of things. She rested her head against his chest and felt the steadiness of him, the heartbeat, the warmth, the specific gravity of a person you trust completely, and thought that she had not expected this, any of this, when she came west with her father in 1879. She had expected the territory and the work and the loneliness of a woman making her own way in a world that was not well designed for it. She had not expected Cornelius Thatcher riding into town with a broken saddle strap and patient gray eyes. She was very glad he had arrived. Their son was born in December of 1883, a few days before Christmas, in the bedroom of the house in Redemption Creek with Eugenia Dalton and the town's physician, Dr. Hartley, in attendance. He was a large baby, which was Cornelius's contribution to the situation, and he had Sallie's gray eyes, which was the universe's contribution to Cornelius's permanent undoing. They named him James Franklin Thatcher, James for Sallie's father, James Mercer, who had taught her to read the wire and whose absence she still felt on certain clear winter days, and Franklin for Cornelius's older brother who had died in the war, whose death had quietly shaped everything about who Cornelius became and who he chose to be. Redemption Creek changed around them in the years that followed, in the way all frontier towns changed in the 1880s. The railroad did eventually come, not Voss's railroad but the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway, which had been extending its reach south through the territory. It came in 1885, and with it came more people and more commerce and more complexity, the full churning social transformation of a railroad arrival. Sallie's telegraph office was upgraded with new equipment. The town's population doubled in 18 months. New businesses opened. The character of the place shifted and settled and shifted again. Through it all, Sallie remained at the key. She supervised now, with a young assistant named Douglas Pine, whom she trained with the same thoroughness her father had trained her, watching for the kind of speed and intuition that could be developed and nurturing it patiently. She sent and received tens of thousands of messages a year. She flagged suspicious content when she found it, which was often enough. The U.S. Attorney's Office in Santa Fe had developed an arrangement with her that was informal but effective. She flagged, they investigated, and the results were good enough that the arrangement continued year after year. Cornelius's work evolved as the territory did. The livestock fraud that had brought him to Redemption Creek remained a constant concern, the kind of crime that adapted as fast as the law closed around it. But his work increasingly intersected with the larger corruption, questions that the growth of the territory's economy generated. He was good at it. He was patient and perceptive and physically capable when physical capability was necessary, and he had a reputation in the territory that opened doors and encouraged cooperation. He was also, by the late 1880s, training a small team of junior inspectors, which he did with a methodical care for their development that those who knew him recognized as his deepest characteristic. In 1886, Sallie became pregnant again. The second child was a daughter, born in July of that year, whom they named Clara Rose Thatcher Clara for the wife Cornelius had lost, which was a choice Sallie made and offered to him, because she had thought carefully about what it meant to love a man who carried someone with him from before you, and had decided that generosity was the right response, and that Clara deserved to be remembered rather than effaced. Cornelius had been very quiet when she suggested the name, and then he had said, in the careful way he handled things that reached deep, "You are the most generous person I have ever known." And she had said, "I am the most practical person you have ever known." She matters to you, so she matters to me. Clara Rose grew up with her mother's gray eyes and her father's decisiveness, and a remarkable gift for arithmetic that first became apparent when she was 4 years old and began doing her father's expense calculations in her head faster than he could add them on paper. Cornelius had looked at Sallie, the first time this happened, with an expression that contained many things, including a very specific amusement. "She gets it from you," he said. "I have no idea what you mean," Sallie said, and smiled. James Franklin grew tall and patient, with his father's build and his mother's deliberate manner of thinking before speaking. By the time he was 5, he had become deeply interested in how the telegraph worked, asking questions about the mechanism and the code with the focused curiosity of a child who will probably make something significant out of that interest. Sallie taught him the Morse alphabet when he was 6, sitting at the practice key she kept at home. He learned it in 2 days. She caught Cornelius watching this from the doorway with an expression of absolute, uncomplicated joy, and the sight of it produced in her something she could only describe as a fullness, the sensation of a life that was genuinely, specifically her own and specifically good. The trial of Harland Voss concluded in January of 1886, after nearly 3 years of legal proceedings that moved with the reliable slowness of territorial justice, amplified by the resources of a very wealthy defendant. Voss's lawyers were skilled and expensive, and they used every delay available to them. But the evidence was too complete and too well documented for any of their strategies to ultimately prevail. Sallie gave testimony twice during the proceedings, once in Santa Fe and once in Denver, both times in a courtroom that was not accustomed to a woman presenting technical evidence with the authority and precision she brought to the task, and both times the reception of her testimony was, she thought, without bitterness, more complicated than it should have been for reasons that had nothing to do with the quality of the evidence. But the evidence prevailed. Harland Voss was convicted of federal land fraud, conspiracy, and bribery of a government official. He was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. Colton Marsh received 4 years. Harris Cade, having cooperated fully, received a suspended sentence and a fine. On the evening after the verdict was announced, she heard it through the wire, of course. Because she heard everything through the wire, Sallie sat in the Telegraph office after her shift ended, in the particular quiet that had accumulated there, and she thought about the 40,000 acres in the Guadalupe Mountains that had been protected by what she had done. She had never been to those mountains. She understood their existence abstractly, as a fact she had defended rather than a place she had known. The people who lived there, whose land it was by right and history and legal agreement, would not know her name and she would not know theirs. The protection she had extended to them was anonymous and indirect. She thought this was more or less the appropriate form of justice. Not personal, not heroic, simply the right outcome, achieved with the tools available. She went home and made supper, and Cornelius came in from a long day in the field with mud on his boots and sunburn on his forearms, and she told him about the verdict. He was quiet for a moment, in the way he absorbed significant things. Then he said, "You did that. The outcome of that trial exists because of what you built and what you sent on the night of October 14. We did it," she said. "You came when I called." "Of course I did," he said simply. She looked at him across the kitchen table of their house in Redemption Creek, in the lamplight of a January evening in 1886. He was 35 years old, silver further through his hair now, the lines around his eyes deeper than they had been in September of 1882. He was also more fully himself than he had been then, or at any rate she knew him more fully, which was a version of the same thing. She understood by now, with the completeness that comes only from years of daily knowing, that he was a genuinely good man, not perfectly good, not uncomplicated, but good at his core in the structural way, the load-bearing way, the way that held up under pressure. She was aware, and not for the first time, that she loved him with a completeness she would not have trusted herself to predict, back when she was 26 and managing the Telegraph office alone and telling herself the loneliness was acceptable. It had been acceptable, and this was better. "Sit down," she said. "The food is getting cold." He sat and they ate, and James Franklin helped himself to 3 biscuits without being invited, which his father noticed and declined to mention, and Clara Rose fell asleep in her chair before the meal was finished, which was a Sunday regular occurrence. The house was warm and ordinary and full. In 1888, a 3rd pregnancy. This one harder than the first 2, Sallie at 32, and the child positioned badly enough that Dr. Hartley, who had been their physician through all of it, was grimly honest with Cornelius about the risks involved. Cornelius sat in the hallway of their house for 11 hours during the delivery, unable to do anything useful, which was an experience he would later describe as the most difficult thing he had ever endured. He was a man built for action and utterly stripped of it, and the fear he felt was clean and terrible, the specific fear of the possible loss of a person who was more essential to him than he had words for. The child came safely. Another boy, smaller than James, had been but vigorous and loud about his opinions from the first moment. They named him Arthur Leonard Thatcher, Leonard for Cornelius's father, and called him Art from the beginning, because the full name was a great deal of name for someone who weighed 7 pounds. Sallie recovered well, though slowly, and Cornelius spent 3 weeks barely leaving the house, which she pretended to find excessive and actually found deeply sustaining. Art grew up with an entirely different character than his siblings, extroverted where they were contained, impulsive where they were deliberate, immediately charming in the way some people simply arrive in the world with the gift of it. He was also, by the time he was 3, clearly his mother's child in the way that James was and Clara was, because Sallie's influence was the deepest current in all of them. Her precision, her ethics, her complete absence of tolerance for dishonesty in any of its forms. When Art was caught in his first significant lie at the age of 4, about the fate of a piece of apple pie that was clearly no longer present in the pan, Sallie sat him down and explained, with complete seriousness, the operational risks of deception, including the long-term loss of credibility that made future communication less effective. He had looked at her with his enormous blue eyes and said, "I ate the pie." And she had said, "I know, I saw you." And he had thought about this and said, "Then why didn't you stop me?" And she had said, "Because knowing something and announcing it immediately are different skills. You should learn both." He grew up to be an attorney, which no one who knew this story found surprising. The years of the 1880s moved through Redemption Creek, as they moved through the whole of the West, with the irreversible momentum of transformation, the railroad era reshaping everything it touched, the territory's population growing, the old open range shrinking before fences and property claims, and the slow legal codification of land rights. Sallie watched it all through the wire and recorded it in the particular way of a telegraph operator, not as history exactly, but as message, the accumulation of what people needed to say to each other across distance. She had by the end of the decade been operating for 15 years total, 10 of them in Redemption Creek, and she had seen enough pass through the key that she had started, in the evenings when the children were in bed, writing it down. Not a memoir exactly. More a record of the specific texture of the time, what people needed to say, what they were afraid of, what they hoped for, the patterns of human intention that the Telegraph made visible to anyone patient enough to read them. Cornelius found her at this writing one night and read a page over her shoulder and said she should finish it. She said it was not for public consumption. She was simply recording it for herself. He said that what was true for herself was often true for more people than that. She said she would think about it. She thought about it for 2 years and finished the manuscript in 1891 and sent it to a publishing house in New York, which rejected it, and then sent it to a different publishing house in Boston, which published it in 1892 under the title Wire and Distance, Notes of a Telegraph Operator in the New Mexico Territory. It was reviewed respectfully in 3 Eastern newspapers and extensively in the territorial papers, and it sold modestly and consistently, and she found the experience of it satisfying in a way that had nothing to do with commercial success. Cornelius bought 10 copies and gave them to colleagues, federal officials, and anyone who expressed an opinion about the West that was more romantic than accurate. The copy he kept for himself had notes in the margins in his handwriting, private responses to what she had written, things he agreed with and things he pushed back on, and things that had moved him enough that he had needed to put a word next to them. She found these margins one evening and read through them, and felt a specific variety of love that she associated specifically with him. The love of being read carefully, of being genuinely engaged with, of existing in another person's mind not as a category but as a specific person. In 1893, the Thatcher House underwent its second significant addition, having been extended once already when Art was born. Cornelius built a room onto the back of the house over the course of 3 weekends, with lumber from the expanded mill east of town and help from James, who at 9 was already becoming seriously useful. The room was intended as a study for Sallie, a private space with a good desk and bookshelves and a window facing east, which she had mentioned would be the right direction for a working window, east for morning light. He built it to her specifications, and she set it up with her books and her ledgers, and the manuscript of a second project she was beginning to develop. And the first morning she sat in it, she looked out the east window at the light coming over the mesa, and felt the kind of quiet satisfaction that is not dramatic and is not loud, and is the deepest form of happiness. Harland Voss died in federal prison in 1890, in his 5th year of his 8-year sentence. The news reached Redemption Creek through the wire, as all news did. Sallie relayed it without comment. That evening she mentioned it to Cornelius, who received it with a brief silence and then said that he hoped the man had spent some portion of his final years understanding what he had tried to do and what it would have meant for the people in those mountains. Sallie said she doubted it, but that it was a reasonable thing to hope. They were agreed on this, as they were agreed on most things, not by suppression of disagreement, but by the genuine convergence of people who had been shaped by the same values and refined by years of honest conversation. By 1895, James was 12 and deeply committed to the study of telegraphy, spending his afternoons after school at the telegraph office with increasing frequency, learning the key under his mother's instruction with a speed that was gratifying and occasionally humbling. He had her facility for the work, or something that would become her facility once it was fully developed. Douglas Pine, who had worked alongside Sallie for over a decade, told her in all seriousness that the boy would surpass them both in 5 years. She said she certainly hoped so. That was the point. Clara was 9 and had moved from arithmetic to geometry, and was conducting her own small-scale surveying experiments in the backyard, with a compass and a length of string, following a methodology she had worked out herself from a textbook she had taken from her mother's shelf and read, without mentioning to anyone. Cornelius had discovered this on a Saturday morning in October, a cool, clear October not unlike the October of 1882, the same blue sky, the same quality of light, and had come inside and found Sallie at the kitchen table reading and said, "Your daughter is surveying the property." And Sallie had said, "I know," and Cornelius had said, "She's 9 years old," and Sallie had said, "My father taught me to read the wire when I was 7, and Cornelius had thought about this and said, "Should we get her proper surveying equipment?" And Sallie had said, "I already ordered it, it's coming from Denver." Art was 7, and was, in the fall of 1895, working his way through the collected speeches of various senators and representatives, with the focus of someone who finds human argument intrinsically fascinating rather than draining. His teacher had told Cornelius and Sallie that he was unusual in his capacity for debate, that he could see both sides of a question simultaneously and articulate each side's strongest form, and that she was uncertain whether this would serve him toward good or toward mischief, depending on how he chose to use it. Cornelius had said he was fairly certain it would be both, in the proportions typical of the species. She had agreed. In November of 1895, Sallie received a letter from the Santa Fe offices of the United States Department of the Interior, which had been reorganized and refocused in the years following the land fraud scandals of the early 1880s, of which the Voss case had been one of the most prominent. The letter was from the department's new Inspector General, a woman named Helena Marsh, no relation to the disgraced Colton Marsh, who had been one of the first women appointed to a federal administrative role in the department. The letter asked Sallie if she would be willing to serve as a civilian consultant on telecommunications security for the department's investigations into land fraud in the territories, a role that would require occasional travel to Santa Fe but could largely be conducted from her existing station. Sallie read the letter twice, folded it carefully, and set it on the kitchen table. When Cornelius came home that evening, she handed it to him without comment and watched him read it. He read it through twice, the way he read important things, and then looked up. "This is recognition," he said, "actual federal recognition of what you do." "It's a consultant role," she said, "civilian. Unpaid, actually, unless I read the letter wrong." "You don't read letters wrong." "Unpaid," she confirmed, "but with federal credentials and access to the department's documentation, which is significant." He looked at her carefully. "What do you want to do?" "I want to accept," she said, "but I want to know that the timing works for the family. James is almost 13, Clara is 9, Art is 7, you're busy with the bureau." "The timing works," he said without hesitation. "It works because you'll manage it the way you manage everything, precisely and effectively. And because I'm here." She studied him. He was 44 years old, more silver than dark in his hair now, the lines of his face fully settled into the face she knew better than any other, the face that had become over the years as necessary as her own reflection. He was a man who had never, in 13 years of marriage and partnership and daily life, suggested that her work was secondary to anything else, never asked her to make herself smaller or quieter or less than she was, never looked at her capacity and felt diminished by it rather than enriched by it. "You're certain," she said. "I have been certain about you," he said, "since September of 1882. That hasn't changed." She accepted the consulting role. The work it brought her over the following years was significant and useful. Several cases were broken with her assistance, her telecommunications expertise filling gaps that federal investigators could not fill themselves, her encrypted message analysis catching schemes that might otherwise have moved too fast to catch. She was never paid for it, which was an injustice she noted and complained about privately and occasionally to relevant officials, and which would eventually, years later, become an argument in the gradual and painfully slow expansion of federal employment opportunities for women. She did not live to see that expansion reach its completion, but she contributed to its momentum, which is often the most anyone manages to contribute to justice. In the spring of 1898, with the newspapers full of the war in Cuba and the country's attention oriented dramatically toward the coasts, Redemption Creek had its own modest drama in the form of a range dispute between two ranchers north of town that escalated to a level requiring federal mediation. Cornelius handled it, spending 3 weeks in the field in conditions that included one memorable night during which a fence-cutting operation turned into a confrontation that he managed without anyone being seriously hurt, which was the outcome he had worked toward, and which took both luck and skill in approximately equal measures. He came home at the end of those 3 weeks trail-worn and quiet in the way of a man who has done something difficult and processed it, but not fully finished with the processing. Sallie watched him for the first day, gave him space as she understood he needed it, and then on the second evening sat next to him on the porch in the cooling air of a May night and put her hand over his without speaking. He turned his hand over and held hers. After a long time he said, "No one was hurt." "I know," she said. "It was close," he said. "I know that too," she said. He tightened his hand on hers. The stars over New Mexico were, as they always were, indiscriminate and astonishing. The same stars that had been over the rock shelf above the creek bed when he had told her he was falling in love with her. The same stars that had been over the town on the night she had sent him the message that brought him 40 miles through the dark. "I have no plans to stop," he said. "The work, I want to be clear about that." "I know," she said. "Neither do I." "Good," he said. "I would worry if you did." She laughed. He laughed. The spring night moved around them, warm and fragrant with the desert sage that bloomed after the April rains, and they sat on the porch of their house in Redemption Creek until the lamp in James's room went out and the house went quiet, and then they went inside. The years of the turn of the century brought changes that were both expected and not. James, at 18, enrolled in an engineering program at the University of New Mexico, having decided that his interest in telegraphy was really an interest in the technical systems that communication depended on, and that the future of those systems was something he wanted to help build. He left Redemption Creek in September of 1901 with his mother's facility for exact work and his father's patient steadiness, and a scholarship that his academic record had earned without assistance. Sallie watched the stage take him east with the composure of a woman who had long practice at managing her emotions privately, and went back to the office and worked the rest of the day with her usual precision, and cried that evening in the kitchen after supper where only Cornelius could see her. He held her for a long time without speaking, which was the right thing. Clara, at 16, was being courted by the son of a rancher from north of town, which was conducted with the full formality appropriate to the period and Cornelius's physical presence, and which Sallie observed with the careful attention of a mother who wanted her daughter to be happy and also to choose with the same kind of clear-sightedness that had served Sallie herself. The young man's name was Edward Howell, and he was decent and genuinely fond of Clara, and slightly afraid of both her parents in a way that Cornelius found appropriate and Sallie found somewhat amusing. They would eventually marry in 1904, when Clara was 19, after Clara had spent 2 years working as a surveyor's assistant, and demonstrating to everyone's satisfaction that she intended to continue that work after marriage, which Edward accepted because he was a sensible man, and because Clara's will was not a negotiable feature of the proposition. Art, at 13 in 1901, was the one still fully at home, filling the house with the particular energy of a child for whom the world is an inexhaustible argument. He and Cornelius developed, in the years when it was just the three of them plus Art, a relationship that was both warm and combative in the way that matched their natures, Art's compulsive rhetoric against Cornelius's measured practicality, and that Sallie watched with affection and occasional strategic intervention. She was 41 in 1901, still at the Telegraph key, still consulting for the Department of the Interior, still the woman through whose hands the news of the territory passed on its way to and from the world. Her hair had some gray in it now, which she neither lamented nor concealed. She was in every meaningful way more herself at 41 than she had been at 26, which was the usual pattern of a life lived with intention. Cornelius was 46, still with the Bureau, now heading the Southwestern Regional Office that he had been offered 3 years earlier, and had accepted on the condition that it be based in Redemption Creek. He was grayer and heavier, and had a scar on his left forearm from the fence-cutting incident of 1898 that white-striped across his skin in a way he had become unconsciously fond of, the body's own record. He was also, by any honest measure, happier than he had been in the life that preceded Sallie, which he acknowledged to himself with the gratitude of a man who understands that this kind of happiness is not guaranteed to anyone, and is therefore not to be taken for granted. In 1903, they celebrated their 21st anniversary in November, which was a cold, clear November with the mountains visible in full snow to the north, and the sky the particular hard blue of high-altitude autumn. James came back from Albuquerque for it, tall now and talking about electrical systems with the enthusiasm of someone living in the future they could already see. Clara and Edward came from the ranch. Art, at 15, took the occasion seriously enough to deliver a short prepared speech at the dinner table about the nature of marriage and its social function that was funny and earnest in roughly equal proportions, and that Cornelius listened to with the expression of a man who is proud and baffled in equal measure. After the children had gone to their beds that night, Cornelius and Sallie sat at the kitchen table with a glass of wine each. The hotel in Redemption Creek had a decent wine supply now, which was one of the side effects of the railroad era, and they were quiet together in the way they had learned to be quiet, the comfortable silence of people who have said most of the important things already and can rest in the residue of them. 21 years, he said. I know, she said. Not exactly what I expected when I rode into town with a broken saddle strap. You expected to spend a week investigating cattle fraud and go back to Santa Fe, she said. I did, he said. I had no idea what was happening. Neither did I, she said, not at first. He looked at her across the kitchen table. The lamp was low, the house was quiet. Outside, the cold November night lay over Redemption Creek in the peaceful way of a town that had come through enough difficulty to have earned its peace. I've been thinking, he said, that I should tell you something I don't say as often as I should. What's that? That I am aware every day of what I have, of what you are. That it doesn't feel ordinary to me, even now. It feels, he paused, doing the thing he always did when he wanted to be exact, like the best decision I ever made was to stay in Redemption Creek past the end of the Hardesty investigation, and I want you to know that I know that. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, the best decision I ever made was to say yes when you asked me on that Sunday afternoon. "I asked you on the porch of your office," he said. "I know where you asked me," she said. "It was the right answer." "Yes," he said. She reached across the table and put her hand over his, the same gesture she had made on the porch 5 years ago, and this time he turned it over and laced his fingers through hers, and the lamp burned low between them, and the night was cold and clear and full of stars. There is a particular quality to a life that has been genuinely built with intention and intelligence, and the specific courage that ordinary difficulty requires, that distinguishes it from a life that has simply happened. Sallie and Cornelius Thatcher had built theirs, piece by piece, from the specific materials of who they were: her precision and independence and brilliant analytical mind, his steadiness and integrity, and the rare quality of a man who can be moved to genuine respect rather than threatened by another person's superiority. What they had made together was not perfect and not without cost, but it was real in the way that only chosen things are real. The telegraph office in Redemption Creek was eventually replaced, as technology always replaces itself, by a telephone exchange in 1907, which was a younger woman's domain. Sallie trained the first telephone exchange operator in the region, a capable girl from Las Cruces named Mina Torres, with the same thorough patience with which she had trained Douglas Pine and then James. She formally retired from Western Union in the spring of 1908, at the age of 52, having operated a telegraph key for 26 years. The regional Western Union supervisor sent a letter of commendation that was gracious and accurate about her contribution to the region's communications infrastructure, and somewhat less accurate, because he didn't know about the full scope of what had been accomplished through her office over the years. She continued her consulting work for the Department of the Interior for another 5 years, until 1913, by which point the department's telecommunications practices had improved enough that her specific expertise was less urgently needed than it had been. She remained, to the end of that work and beyond it, the only person who had ever broken the cipher she herself had invented, which was a distinction she found privately satisfying. Cornelius retired from the Bureau of Livestock Inspection in 1910, at the age of 59, which was later than most men in similar work retired and sooner than he would have preferred. The paperwork had grown in proportion to the bureaucracy, and the field work had grown rarer as the territory's law enforcement infrastructure developed, and the combination was producing a form of professional frustration he recognized as the signal to move on. He spent the first year of retirement uncomfortable and restless, and the second year building a barn addition to the property outside of Redemption Creek they had purchased as an investment in 1899, and which had become, without any deliberate plan, the home they moved to when they wanted space. Sallie watched him build the barn addition with the patience she extended to all his projects, and with the specific pleasure of watching a man who is very good with his hands do something that requires it. By 1912, all 3 children were fully launched in their separate lives. James worked in Albuquerque as an electrical engineer for the Southwest Telephone Company, contributing to the infrastructure that was slowly networking the territory, in the same way the telegraph had networked it a generation earlier, and which he thought of explicitly and often as his mother's legacy given form in wire and current. He married a woman named Ruth Galloway in 1906, a schoolteacher from Santa Fe, and had 2 daughters and a son. Clara and Edward ran their ranch north of Redemption Creek, and Clara continued her surveying work, having eventually obtained formal credentials from the Territorial Surveyor's Office, which had been persuaded, not without difficulty, to test her on the merits. They had 4 children. Art finished his law degree in 1906 and returned to New Mexico to practice, eventually specializing in land rights cases, Apache and Navajo land claims specifically, a choice of specialty that had everything to do with the story of his mother and the night of October 14, 1882, which he had been told at an age when it became the story that shaped what he believed he was for. In 1915, Cornelius and Sallie Thatcher were both in their 60s, living in their house outside Redemption Creek in a life that was quieter than what had preceded it but not emptier. They gardened, Sallie with the same methodical efficiency she brought to everything, Cornelius with a patience that surprised him, and they read, and they argued about politics and policy and the state of the territories, now states, with the vigor of people who have never stopped caring about such things. James came with his family twice a year. Clara and Edward came more often since they were closer. Art came when his caseload permitted, which was less often than any of them wanted but more often than the caseload technically allowed. They were, in 1915, in the 33rd year of their life together, and they were well. Sallie still sometimes sat in her study in the mornings, at the east window, reading or writing, in the light that came over the mesa in that particular way of New Mexico light, clean and honest and unsentimental. She had begun work on a second book, broader in scope than the first, about the role of telecommunications in the shaping of the frontier West, a historical and sociological account rather than a personal narrative, drawing on her records and her memory and a correspondence she had maintained over the years with other telegraph operators, many of them women, whose work had been as central and as invisible as her own. She wrote it slowly and carefully and finished it in 1917, and it was published in 1918, and it was more widely reviewed than the first book and is still occasionally cited in histories of the period. On the morning she finished the final page of that manuscript, she set down her pen and looked out the east window at the light on the mesa for a long time. Then she heard Cornelius in the kitchen, the familiar sounds of a man making coffee in the morning, the creak of the cabinet, the clatter of the pot, the specific rhythm she had been hearing for 35 years, and which was among the most comforting sounds in her experience. And she got up from the desk and went to the kitchen. He was standing at the stove with his back to her, in the early light, gray-haired and broad in the shoulders and steady as he had always been, the particular solidity of him that she had identified on the first day and had been grateful for on every day since. "I finished it," she said. He turned around. He read her face the way he had learned over 35 years to read it, precisely, attentively, with the full commitment of someone for whom she was the most important text he had ever studied. He smiled, slow and sure and real. "Come sit down," he said. "I'll pour you a cup." She sat at the kitchen table of the house that had been theirs for 18 years, in the morning light of 1917, and Cornelius poured the coffee and sat across from her, and the New Mexico sun came through the windows and lay warm on the table between them. They had built something true. They had made it out of intelligence and patience, and the specific courage of two people who chose each other freely and kept choosing, day after day, through the difficulty and the joy and the ordinary extraordinary accumulation of a life shared. The rail baron had thought he won. He had not accounted for the woman at the key. And the woman at the key had found, in the man who rode 40 miles through the dark to answer her signal, the only thing she had not known to look for. All of it was real, and none of it was over, and outside the kitchen window the mesa stood in the morning light, ancient and patient and unchanged, while the world moved around it and two people drank coffee in the house they had made.